Every single state, and I mean every state, no matter if we're talking about something ancient or something happening right now.
Right, the era doesn't matter.
Exactly. They all eventually run into this foundational constitutional question. And how they answer it really determines their entire lifespan.
It's the ultimate political fault line, isn't it? It runs through all of human history.
It really does. And the question is, where does the final non-negotiable authority to rule actually come from?
Is it the state?
Hmm.
The institutions we see, legislatures, courts, the executive? Or is it a parallel spiritual authority? One that claims its mandate comes from somewhere higher, from the divine.
And that's not just a philosophical debate club topic.
Oh, not at all. When that question hits the actual machinery of a state, it becomes a full-blown constitutional crisis.
Because if the sources of legitimacy, the fundamental right to make and enforce laws, if that's split,
the state can't function. It's paralyzed. You have two different groups claiming the final say, and that's a recipe for dissolution from the inside out.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what we're diving into today, the actual mechanism of that failure. We're looking at a really specialized analysis that connects these spectacular historical collapses, things that happened centuries ago,
Right.
directly with some very urgent, very modern constitutional battles happening in democracies today. The whole focus is on the danger of that fragmented authority.
And the source material we're working from, it lays out this incredibly clear pattern, almost deterministic. It shows that any system, whether by accident or by design, that allows religious authority to act as a competing, unchecked source of political legitimacy.
Which is fundamentally unstable.
It's unstable, and it's incredibly vulnerable to collapse.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Our deep dive today is all about this one powerful and kind of terrifyingly consistent constitutional lesson. It works across time, across geography, and it is this. When spiritual authority competes directly with political authority, the state splits and collapse becomes pretty much inevitable. For a state to be stable, authority has to be unified.
And we're going to put that principle to the test. We're going to look at it across 800 years of history with 3 totally different societies that were all facing the exact same core challenge.
So first, we're going to dissect the complete and frankly spectacular internal collapse of the Fatimid Caliphate in 1171.
A true powerhouse of its time.
Then we're going to pivot to the complete opposite path, the revolutionary constitutional fix that King Henry VIII engineered in 1534. He saved his date by unifying that same authority.
A very different solution.
And finally, we're bringing it into the modern world. We'll explore the crucible of Pakistan's sit-in crisis, which happened between 2014 and 2017, and see how a modern democracy tried to resolve it.
And what's so fascinating here, is that the fundamental questions are identical. Who gets the final say on law, on the economy? Who decides if the ruler is legitimate? The problems are the same.
It's the solutions that change.
The solutions are what determine whether a state survives or not.
And that's our mission today, to find those core principles of stability hidden inside these incredible stories of failure and, in some cases, near failure. So let's start with maybe the most complete example of this internal constitutional breakdown, the Fatimids.
When we talk about the Fatimid Caliphate, we really have to start by appreciating its strength. This wasn't some fragile backwater state.
No, not at all. This was a regional superpower.
A superpower. They ruled Egypt, huge parts of North Africa, for more than 250 years. From the 10th to the 12th century, they built Cairo.
And it was an incredibly vibrant civilization, wasn't it? Our sources really emphasize the intellectual energy. They highlight institutions like Al-Azhar University.
Which they founded in 970 CE, still one of the most important centers of learning in the world.
Right, and they weren't just culturally rich. They were ahead of their time in administration, in astronomy, medicine, law. They had massive libraries. They managed these huge, sophisticated trade networks all the way from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean.
They had everything. All the ingredients you would think you need for long-term success. They had wealth, they had intellectual capital, a professional administrative class.
Which makes their collapse all the more jarring and, well, instructive for us.
Exactly. They didn't fall because they were conquered in a huge war or because of some sudden famine. As our analysis points out, the end was structural. The cause was dual religious authority and constitutional fragmentation.
So the seeds of their own destruction were baked into their system from the very beginning.
Planted right in their foundational theory of government.
I think we need to pause on that term, constitutional fragmentation. It sounds a bit academic, but what it really means here is that the governing structure itself was designed to create conflict.
It was. Independent of who was in charge, a good ruler, a bad ruler, it didn't matter. The system itself was the problem.
So what was the fatal flaw?
It was this unique and ultimately just unsustainable claim that the Fatimid rulers made. They were trying to wear two crowns at the same time.
And these crowns represented two different, often competing worlds.
Completely. On one hand, they were the caliph, that's the temporal head of state. He's responsible for the army, for collecting taxes, for the treasury, the day-to-day administration.
The political
job. But at the same time, they also claimed to be the imam of the Ismaili community. And that meant they held the ultimate infallible spiritual authority. This was a divine legitimacy, they claimed, that came directly through their lineage from the prophet's daughter, Fatima.
Wow. So their power wasn't just based on controlling the state. It was tied to this theological claim of being a divine guide on earth. That puts the entire system under an incredible amount of pressure.
It does, and this is where the split with their own population becomes a major constitutional hazard. You see, the Fatimids were Ismaili Shia,
Right.
but the vast majority of the people they were ruling in Egypt, they were Sunni Muslims. And Sunnis followed the Abbasid model, which had a clearer separation between the religious scholars, the ulama, and the political leader, the caliph.
So the very existence of the Fatimid state was an ongoing theological argument.
An existential one. The legitimacy of the government was constantly being disputed by most of the people being governed, not over a specific policy like a tax hike.
But over the fundamental right of the ruler to even call himself Imam Caliph.
Exactly. And this dual claim, this split, it had these cascading negative consequences that seeped into every part of the state's functioning.
So you immediately get a fracturing of loyalty.
Immediately. If you're a bureaucrat or an army general,
Mm-hmm.
who do you actually serve? The caliphate that pays your salary, or the imam that you believe holds the key to your salvation?
And what happens when those two things come into conflict?
That's the crisis. And our sources give us some very specific examples of how this fragmentation paralyzed the government on the ground.
So it wasn't just a theoretical problem.
Not at all. The Fatimids had their civil administration, but they also operated something called the Dawah. This was their secretive religious missionary structure. Its job was to spread Ismaili doctrine and ensure ideological purity.
A kind of parallel government, a shadow government.
That's a great way to put it. And for the most committed followers, the Dawah commanded far more loyalty than the regular civil service. It completely confused the lines of command and control.
And I imagine that extends to the legal system, which is where a state's authority is really tested.
It's the ultimate sign of a state losing coherence. You ended up with competing judicial systems. The state-appointed Ismaili judges were constantly being challenged by the Sunni majority, who were loyal to their own legal schools and often operated their own local courts, especially for things like property or inheritance.
So if the laws themselves have two competing sources of legitimacy, the state can't really function. How do you reliably collect taxes or enforce contracts?
You can't. Not effectively. The whole system becomes a machine for creating internal division. It constantly fueled rebellions and infighting within the military, often along these very sectarian lines.
And as time went on, the real power must have shifted away from the Caliph Imam himself.
It did. It shifted to the viziers, the chief ministers. They were the ones who actually controlled the armies and the treasury. The Caliph Imam became more and more isolated. A spiritual symbol, yes, but not a real constitutional power.
And the last Fatimid ruler, Caliph al-Adid, is kind of the perfect example of this decay.
The perfect illustration. He held the title. He was supposedly the infallible spiritual leader. But in the real world, the temporal sphere, he was effectively powerless.
A prisoner in his own palace.
Our sources confirm that, yes. He was a prisoner of his court. The viziers were fighting these brutal power struggles, using their influence over different military factions, mercenaries from different ethnic and religious backgrounds to control the state.
And al-Adid's spiritual authority couldn't stop it.
It was useless for restoring order because the political machinery had already collapsed under the weight of all these competing claims. The ultimate sign of fragmentation is when the head of state loses all real command power. He becomes purely ceremonial.
So this creates this enormous power vacuum right in the middle of one of the most strategic regions in the world, this deep internal weakness, this constitutional paralysis. It's basically an open invitation for someone to step in from the outside.
It was, and here's where it gets really interesting. The political corpse of the Fatimid state was just lying there, waiting to be claimed.
And the person who claimed it was the famous Sunni general Salahuddin Ayyubi.
Saladin. He had originally been sent to Egypt to help the weakened Caliphate fight off the Crusaders.
But he didn't have to conquer a strong, unified empire. He just had to pick up the pieces of a state that had already shattered itself from within.
Exactly. And his final decisive move in 1171 wasn't a great battle, it was a constitutional act.
He formally abolished the Fatimid Caliphate.
He did. And the single act that ended centuries of their rule was a simple liturgical change. He ordered the restoration of the Abbasid Caliph's name in the Friday sermon, the khutbah.
The khutbah. For anyone listening who might not be familiar, you're saying this is the universally recognized symbolic act of political loyalty. So why did just changing a name in a sermon have the constitutional force of a modern coup?
Because the khutbah is so much more than a speech. It's the public, weekly, ritual confirmation of political sovereignty in the Islamic world. To have the ruler's name mentioned is to publicly acknowledge his supreme temporal authority and legitimacy.
So by swapping the name of the Ismaili Imam Caliph al-Adid for the name of the distant Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad.
Saladin fundamentally shifted the source of all legal and political legitimacy in Egypt overnight. He ended the dual structure. He replaced it with a single Sunni-based system where the ruler on the ground himself acknowledged a distant, non-competing caliph.
He unified authority, but the entire regime had to die for it to happen. The core lesson here is, it's just chillingly clear. The Fatimids collapsed because the demands of religion overpowered the state. Competing religious claims became the tool that was used to fragment, challenge, and ultimately destroy the state's political legitimacy from the inside.
So if the Fatimids show us the ultimate failure, a state that's literally consumed by its own internal contradictions,
Right.
then the case of King Henry VIII gives us this powerful contrasting lesson. It shows us how a state can survive and even stabilize by totally redefining that relationship and unifying authority under the temporal ruler.
We're jumping from 12th century Egypt to 16th century England, but you're right, the constitutional problem Henry faced is shockingly similar to the one that destroyed the Fatimids.
It is. You have a political ruler up against a competing spiritual authority that claims ultimate, non-negotiable power over his kingdom.
And while the trigger was personal, wasn't it? Henry's desperate need for an annulment from Catherine of Aragon to get a male heir.
Of course. But the real fight wasn't about a marriage. It was about jurisdiction. It was about who held imperium, the supreme right to command over England.
The Pope was essentially acting as an external sovereign. He was claiming judicial power over England's most critical domestic issue, the royal succession.
And when the Pope refused to grant that annulment, it wasn't just personal animosity. It was a defense of the papacy's claim to universal spiritual authority over all of Catholic Europe. If he had given in to Henry, he would have weakened that universal claim everywhere.
So his refusal was a direct existential challenge to Henry's sovereignty inside his own borders.
And Henry understood that perfectly. He realized that as long as this external spiritual power, the Pope in Rome, could veto his most fundamental domestic policies, he wasn't a true sovereign.
So his response wasn't to raise an army against Rome, it was constitutional.
A systematic, masterful, and utterly decisive constitutional intervention. And he did it through the highest legal body in the land, Parliament.
So he didn't just declare it by royal decree. He had to build the legal case, didn't he? He had to dismantle centuries of papal influence, piece by piece, using the law.
That's what makes it so brilliant and so effective. It wasn't one act, it was a sequence of acts, each one designed to systematically strip ecclesiastical power away from Rome and transfer it to the crown.
And the really critical first step was the Act and Restraint of Appeals in 1533.
That's the one. Let's focus on that for a second because it was truly revolutionary. The preamble to that act declared that England was an empire.
An empire. Meaning what in that context?
Meaning it was a sovereign entity governed by one supreme head and king who had all the necessary spiritual and temporal power to resolve any and all legal cases within his realm, including marriage and succession.
So that act just unilaterally cut off all legal appeals to Rome.
It did. It established English legal and spiritual independence with the stroke of a pen.
That's the moment the idea of a single, unified national sovereignty is actually written into law. Before 1533, the Church's courts were ultimately accountable to the Pope. After 1533, they were accountable only to the king. He was closing that gap of constitutional fragmentation.
Exactly. He established that all legal authority was internal to England. And once he had that foundation, he moved quickly. And that culminated, of course, in the famous Act of Supremacy of 1534.
This was the final statement. No more nuance.
No, the declaration was simple and absolute. The king is the supreme head of the Church of England.
And that is the stark opposite of what happened with the Fatimids. They tried to hold two identities, political caliph and spiritual imam, and the state fractured. Henry VIII created a single identity. He merged the political and the spiritual right under the crown. The church effectively became a department of the state.
And the effects of this legal revolution were immediate and they were total. It went so far beyond just getting his annulment.
It severed everything. All the legal, judicial, and financial ties to Rome were cut. The flow of money and legal cases out of England just stopped.
And the crown became the final court of appeal for everything. Spiritual or temporal, it didn't matter. The king was the final word.
And this huge political move was then immediately reinforced with economic power. Right. The dissolution of the monasteries, which started in 1536. This was way more than just a cash grab for the treasury.
Oh, absolutely. It was a constitutional statement backed by overwhelming force. The monasteries were the physical infrastructure of the papacy's power in England. They represented that deep, entrenched external loyalty.
So by dissolving them, Henry wasn't just seizing their wealth, which was enormous, something like a fifth of all the cultivated land in England.
He was physically demolishing the competing power structure. He centralized that vast political and economic power directly in the crown, reinforcing his new spiritual authority with very tangible assets.
So the English state was essentially paying for its own growth, its own military, by taking over the religious sphere.
It was. It transformed England into what our source material calls a sovereign constitutional monarchy, where the king's temporal law was the supreme law. And all religious matters, doctrine, appointments, money, were managed by a new state-controlled Church of England.
Okay, let's pause here and really draw the comparison because the source material makes this so clear. You have two historical pivots arising from the same structural problem, but with completely opposite outcomes.
It's a perfect A-B test of constitutional theory, separated by a few hundred years. The direction of centralization is what matters.
So on one side, you have the Fatimids. They tried to maintain two competing, doctrinally divided sources of authority. That led to internal fragmentation, a permanent legitimacy crisis.
And the state became paralyzed. It was taken hostage by its own internal religious structure, which ultimately allowed it to be destroyed. The result, total collapse.
Then you have Henry VIII. He's facing a similar challenge from an external religious authority claiming power inside his kingdom.
And his response is a decisive legal reform to centralize all national authority under the crown.
The result is a radically stronger monarchy and a stabilized nation. Why? Because the religious structure was legally and forcefully subordinated to the state.
The lesson is just undeniable. The Fatimids failed because their system allowed religion to break the state apart. Henry VIII stabilized his state precisely because the state redefined its relationship with religion. It used constitutional tools to subordinate the spiritual to the temporal, and in doing so, it unified authority. The key to survival was eliminating that competing source of power. So if the Fatimids give us this ancient, clear warning about internal structural collapse.
And Henry VIII gives us the monarchical solution for dealing with external spiritual interference.
The question then becomes, what happens when this ancient problem explodes inside a modern, complex constitutional democracy?
And for that, we turn to Pakistan, a nation where that tension between religious identity and the mechanisms of a secular state is always present, and where constitutional stability is constantly being tested by mass movements that are rooted in faith.
Right. And here, the idea of competing authority doesn't come from a caliph or a king. It comes from non-state actors who use mass mobilization to challenge the state.
That's the key modern twist. The challenge came in the form of these critical sit-ins, or dharnas, and these weren't just protests.
No, these were huge, sometimes months-long blockades of the state itself. They were aimed at forcing radical political changes, and they were often justified with religious arguments. It's a modern attempt to use an extra-constitutional pressure campaign, a parallel authority derived from the street to get what you want.
And the sources point to two major events that really highlighted this danger of fragmentation. First, the massive 2014 PTI Pat Dharna, and then the really volatile 2017 Faizabad sit-in.
The details matter here. In 2014, you had a political party, the PTI, led by Imran Khan, and a spiritual political movement, PT, led by Tahir al-Qadri.
And what was their demand?
The immediate resignation of the elected government and massive electoral reform, all while blockading the capital city, Islamabad.
So they were trying to use physical disruption to force the dissolution of a constitutionally elected parliament. They were trying to bypass the entire electoral system.
Exactly. And that immediately weakens the authority of the central state. I mean, if an elected government can be toppled just by blocking enough roads, then the electoral system, the parliament, they stop being the primary source of political legitimacy.
But the crisis got even deeper in 2017 with the Fatimid sit-in.
It did. That one involved a more purely religious group, the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, or TLP. Their protest was sparked by a change to the oath that elected officials take. They claimed it undermined a core Islamic belief about the finality of the prophet.
So in 2017, the challenge was explicitly religious and doctrinal, but the method was purely political.
Purely political. A complete physical blockade of the main highway connecting Islamabad with the city of Rawalpindi. This brought the capital to a standstill. It blocked access to the Supreme Court, to Parliament. It stopped commerce, daily life, everything.
And this is where it becomes so relevant for you, the listener, today. These events raised these profound constitutional questions about where the boundaries of state power are in a democracy that also allows for religious freedom and assembly.
That's the conflict. Can a religious or political group use what they see as a spiritual mandate to justify blockades that completely obstruct the fundamental rights of millions of other citizens?
It's the right to protest clashing directly with the right to freedom of movement.
And crucially, how does a modern state with a secular constitution negotiate with a religious cleric who commands thousands of followers, an authority that operates completely outside the legislative system? If you negotiate, you look like you're surrendering sovereignty.
And if you don't, you risk a violent confrontation.
It's an impossible position. And the crisis really did echo the Fatimid decline. You had a parallel religious authority using mass devotion and doctrinal claims to challenge the central elected state. And the result was a weakening of governance and just this widespread confusion about where the constitutional lines were supposed to be.
When the executive branch seems paralyzed, as it clearly did in 2017, that power vacuum has to be filled by something.
And in this case, it forced the judiciary to step in. The courts became the constitutional mechanism that had to clarify the limits of state power versus religious protest.
And the resolution, or at least the constitutional clarification, came in the form of the landmark Fatimid judgment of 2019, which was delivered by Justice Qazi Fayaziza.
A monumental ruling. It was a powerful assertion of constitutional supremacy. It drew a very clear line in the sand between religious expression and the governance of the state.
What were the key principles it laid down?
Well, the ruling was very detailed. It established, based on specific constitutional articles, that while the right to assembly is fundamental, it cannot be used to block the fundamental rights of other citizens to move and conduct their lives.
So the collective rights of the millions outweigh the right of a protest group to paralyze the state.
That was the core principle. And Justice Issa was unequivocal about the state's duty. He argued the government has a clear, non-negotiable obligation to maintain order and protect the rights of all citizens. The state can't just step back out of fear or political convenience because that itself breaks the social contract.
Did it address the issue of internal fragmentation? The idea that parts of the state might be quietly supporting these challenges?
It did, and this part was crucial. It specifically mandated that any intelligence or security officials who violate their oath by encouraging or taking part in these extra-constitutional movements must be legally pursued.
So it was an institutional check against the state, sabotaging itself from within.
Precisely. And the court's core statement brings us right back to our central theme of unifying authority under the law. The judgment clearly stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, no group, religious or political, can claim a right to overthrow the elected government or obstruct the state. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land.
It was a judicial decree that the constitutional system is sacred. It cannot be bypassed by any parallel claim, whether that claim is spiritual or just based on mob rule.
And that is why Pakistan, though it was severely tested, avoided the fate of the Fatimids. The state struggled, but in the end, an established institution, the Supreme Court, intervened decisively.
They asserted constitutional sovereignty over the competing factions. It allowed the state to reassert its singular authority, an authority rooted in law.
The lesson for a modern democracy is incredibly powerful. Pakistan avoided total collapse because its institutions had the legal means and the clarity to draw those boundaries and unify authority under the Constitution, preventing those powerful competing claims from causing total paralysis. So we tie this whole journey together, this path through history, the constitutional trajectories of the Fatimid Caliphate, Tudor England, and modern Pakistan, They all point to one single consistent mechanism that determines whether a state remains stable.
Let's synthesize those outcomes one last time, just to make it crystal clear.
Let's do it.
First, we saw the Fatimid collapse. They made a structural choice to have a dual religious political authority. That led directly to fragmentation and a permanent legitimacy crisis.
And the state became a hostage to its own religious hierarchy, which acted as a competing sovereign power. It was fatally weakened.
Then we have Henry VIII. He faced a crisis of dual authority, his own crown versus the external pope. He used constitutional reform to nationalize and centralize all that power.
By making the church subordinate to the state, he got rid of the competing source of authority. The result was stabilization and a much stronger, unified monarchy.
And finally, the Pakistan crisis. You have institutional polarization driven by these powerful religious movements that severely challenge the state's legitimacy.
But crucially, judicial intervention preserved the constitutional order. By clarifying that constitutional law is supreme and that the state has a duty to enforce it, the state was able to fight back and reassert its singular unified authority.
So the ratio decidendi, as the lawyers would say, the core reason behind all three of these stories.
It crystallizes into a timeless principle. It means that across all civilizations, all ages, the conclusion is the same. Constitutional order collapses when religious authority is allowed to act as an unchecked competitor to political authority.
For a state to be stable, you have to have clear, unambiguous, and enforced boundaries between faith, law, and governance.
And this isn't an argument against faith. It's a critical, legal, and constitutional distinction. The principle is that a nation absolutely must honor religious rights. People must be free to practice their faith. But governance has to remain constitutional. It has to be secular in its application of the law, and it must be absolutely unified in where its ultimate authority comes from.
A nation can only survive when that ultimate authority is defined and unified under justice and constitutional law. That's what ensures that no single faction, whether it's waving a secular flag or claiming a divine right, can just veto or overthrow the whole system.
The stakes couldn't be higher. The Fatimid collapse reshaped the Middle East for centuries.
Henry VIII's reforms permanently changed Europe's religious and political map.
And the Fatimid judgment fundamentally reshaped the state-religion relationship in modern Pakistan. The success or failure of these huge societies hinged entirely on their ability to draw a constitutional line in the sand.
And their willingness to enforce that line when it was challenged.
That's the key.
So the question that this entire deep dive leaves for you, the listener, is this. In the societies and governments that you see around you today, how clearly and how definitively are those lines drawn between ultimate political power and ultimate spiritual power? And based on that clarity or lack of it, what historical trajectory, fragmentation, or unification does that constitutional structure suggest for their future stability? End of deep dive.